welcome anybody who's new to these chaotic events. My name is Jamie Dobson. I am the Chief Executive of Container Solutions, but one of the nicest parts of my job is I get to do things with the community, either in person at conferences. I occasionally write. I did write a book once. If you need to go to sleep, if you've got any troubles with insomnia, buy a copy of that book. Your lights will be out in 2 minutes. And I get to do these what the fucking hours with my wonderful friends and guests. Today's What the Fucking Art is with Ian, and we're going to be talking about repatriation. Now, to those people who are not new, you know what's about to come next. There is going to be a small mention about housekeeping. We're going to make some announcements, and then, of course, we're going to move into the main event. We do usually have a gossip section. There is no gossip today, but I made up for that with my joke about Ian and magicians. I hope that went down well. Housekeeping, we mainly focus on the code of conduct in this part. So Carla will share a copy of the code of conduct. It tells you all to be reasonable, respectful, and kind to each other. Please do take a look at that if you haven't seen it before. We do enforce the code of conduct. Breaches are taken seriously. You can bring any potential breaches to my attention, to Carla's attention, and it will be dealt with. And if, in an extreme case, we have to, people will be removed from this event. We're doing this because the space, the technology space, it wasn't always safe for everybody, but we are part of a bunch of people who are trying to make it safe and inclusive for everybody who's interested in technology. So this is why we have a code of conduct, and this is why we take this stuff seriously. Announcements. Yes, you can subscribe to our newsletter. We're the least spammy newsletter people on the planet, in the earth, or I can't speak anymore. We are non-spammy. If you scan that QR code, you can get access to upcoming events, free content, an amazing newsletter. It's the envy of many people in the industry. And if you're interested in a job, you can click this box that says, I'm interested in a job. If you're interested in buying something, you can click that box as well, but you don't have to. You can just subscribe at the level that you are interested in. And if you don't click any of those other boxes, you won't hear anything about jobs, potential work, etc., etc. We're proud of our mission, which is to educate as many people about cloud native as possible. This does mean that we also do in-person events. We have a live panel in both Amsterdam and in London. Now, I get the feeling I should know a little bit more about these events. Carla, what are these two events?
Well, actually, these events, we're very excited about them because they're live conversations about DevX, developer experience. And it's a topic that we saw getting more and more traction in the past months. We covered the WTF issue as well. So at the moment, the date in London is being rescheduled because there is a rail strike, of course.
I've just heard the rail strike has been cancelled. I heard that 5 minutes ago.
What?
So you might need to reschedule your rescheduling.
Oh, that's great.
Okay, so these are in-person live events. And who is hosting these events from our side?
Well, from our side in London is one of our super engineers, Robel, who's also going to be hosting one of the tracks of the conference. The WTF is a conference on DevX. So it's all DevX
all tied together, exactly. Yeah. So Robel will be hosting the one in London, and then he'll be appearing at our conference. I'll mention that in a second. And the one in Amsterdam will be hosted by
Kari, another lead engineer of CS. So
another lead engineer. So we've been talking a lot at Container Solutions recently about engineering-led marketing and engineering-led sales. This is kind of what we mean by that. So what that means is that those events, you won't have to put up with anybody like me. You'll get to meet an actual real-life engineer who actually programs things. I haven't done that for about 15 years, much to my regret, actually. All right, speaking of WTF, we do have a conference coming up. You can sign up now. It's going to be awesome. This is running from the 4th to the 5th of May. It's the first time, I think the first time we've come back in person with the conference, Carla, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Since the pandemic. Amazing speakers. Check out the website. Brilliant speakers, loads of brilliant attendees, lots of brilliant sponsors. And I know what you're thinking. If you're watching this thinking, should I sponsor, shouldn't I sponsor? You should probably sponsor, right? You get brilliant bang for your buck because it's a nice conference and all the cool people come along to it. And that is no, it's not my final announcement. Oh, my book, the book. Listen to this, a fantastic book about cloud native DevOps and modern software. What an amazing review. The book is free to download. Now, it's not free on Amazon. It costs you about $50. So if you want a physical copy, go ahead and get it. However, if you'd like a free copy of the book in PDF, go ahead, sign up or stick in your details on the website now, and you can get a free copy of the book. Many people who went cloud native, if going cloud native is even a way to describe it, have done so successfully with lots of the patterns and guidance and tips and tricks that appear in that book. So we're quite proud of that. It's not really my book. It was written by 3 people, and I did the smallest part. But I was very proud to be involved, and there's basically at least 10 years worth of best practice baked into that book. And now, the main event. David Baddiel himself. Ian. David Baddiel lookalike extraordinaire.
You'll pay for that. You'll pay for that, Jamie.
I know. I suspect I will. I've outed you. I'm so sorry. How are you, mate?
All right, not bad. Yeah, I get people in the street shouting that at me, so I'm quite used to it. Thank you.
So I'm going to stop sharing now, Ian, so that you can share and then step the people through the questions. I think have I stopped sharing already?
Yeah, I should be sharing now.
Perfect. No, you did that seamlessly. Professional.
Seamless. Until you
right, Ian,
mentioned
in that case, it's over to you.
All right, Jamie, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone, to this seminar on when, if ever, is cloud repatriation the right move. It would be great if you can put stuff in the chat during this. I really welcome that kind of engagement, because this is a particularly it's a topic that gets people's blood boiling one way or the other. So yeah, please do that. This came up recently. This topic came up recently again, and it surfaces every now and again. So about 2 weeks ago, I published a piece on it on our blog, which was quite well received. And as a result, we thought we'd do a webinar on it to see what to get some live response to it. So let me, actually, I need to activate my chat. How do I do that?
Now, Ian, is it fair to say one of the reasons we wanted to do this? So first of all, we don't have a horse in this race, do we? We don't sell repatriation services. It's not something we're pushing. So so commercially, we're interested in everything. We move people to the cloud. We can move them back if they like. But this topic is divisive, isn't it? And that's one of the reasons we wanted to sort of poke it a little bit.
It's very divisive. Sorry, I'm still struggling to find how I can get chat up on while I'm looking at it.
Shall I send you a message and then maybe it will appear?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, yeah. It is a very divisive topic, and I mean, I'll come onto this in the talk, but also we don't have a horse in this race. Most people think because we're a cloud native consultancy that we're pushing cloud on our clients, and often that's not the case. Often we tell them not to, that we don't think it's a good idea for them to use cloud. Cloud native, of course, doesn't mean use cloud service providers, use the hyperscalers. It can also be on-prem, and we even have customers who are not on the internet in production. So yeah, it is a subject that comes up with our customers every now and again, but it's not something we're particularly invested in. I still can't get chat up. I don't know. Well, if you're chatting to me, I can't see it.
I'll monitor the chat, Ian. Don't worry. All
right. So can you look out for me? Thank you. All right. So let's go on. Okay. So the talk today, I will going to be covering the following topics in roughly the following way. So we can talk about why it's a hot topic, who's done cloud repatriation, talk a little bit about cloud refuseniks, people who are not going to the cloud. Talk a little bit about who should consider it and who maybe should not consider repatriation. And then finally, we're going to look at what's next for the whole topic of repatriation and cloud in or out.
And I would just like to say at this point, Ian has specifically asked me to be obnoxious and interject today to get the questions and conversation flowing. He really did ask me that. And I said, that's easy because that's what I'm like normally. So if anybody's got any questions, get them in the chat. And if you really feel compelled to scream out, we think you should go ahead and scream out. Is that right, Ian?
That's right. Yeah, I didn't need to tell you to do that. I knew that's what you'd bring to the table.
It comes naturally. It comes so naturally to me.
Okay, so the thing that triggered this, triggered the resurgence of this debate recently was a piece by David Heinemeier Hansen. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Who is CTO of 37 Signals. And he's talking about, in this piece that he wrote recently, he's talking about a company or a product, I'm not sure if it's a product or a separate company, but a company he runs called Hey, which is a Gmail, some sort of email service, sort of future productivity focused email service that was built a few years ago. And he's been blogging for the last 6 months, occasionally mentioning that they're planning to get out of the cloud. And this was the sort of the money shot, really. This was the piece where he's saying it's a huge success. And this triggered a whole lot of discussion in the field. Basically, he claims that he's spending $600,000 on servers to save $7 million over 5 years. And a lot of people critiqued it sort of in a knee-jerk way. They didn't actually read all of his posts, because although it's quite a contentious post or a provocative post, if you read his various posts on the subject and take away some of the hype, he's actually talking about quite a limited use case. But is aware of the argument's limitations. But many of the critiques of the piece focused on, he hasn't considered the cost of managing all this stuff off the cloud. He's naive about that, or he was assuming that he was saying everyone should get off the cloud now, which neither of those were actually fair critiques. And we'll go into that a bit more. But if you read this piece, which is linked, do we send the slides out, Carla?
Yes, we do, in the follow-up email tomorrow.
Okay, great. So you'll get the slides with the links, put the links on the bottom right of the slides if you're interested in looking further. But if you do go and read this piece, make sure to read his other previous pieces where he goes through his logic a little bit more, less sensationally. So anyway, yes, this is why the subject has come up again recently. And the debate on cloud repatriation is particularly hot in the sense that there's a lot of vitriol on both sides. So I've taken some of these out here. You can see Camille Fournier says, I swear the idea that cloud workload repatriation, in quotes, is a good idea gets just more absurd the longer I think about it. And it started out pretty high on the absurdity scale. If you read down the thread, she gets also a bit less attention grabbing in her statements, but it's not an uncommon response. Also, Corey Quinn, who's also very active on social media and works for a company that does cloud cost optimization, I think particularly for AWS, but not necessarily uniquely for AWS. In his last week in AWS blog, he talks about cloud repatriation and says it's not a thing. So absolutely definitively, it's not a thing. And also he casts aspersions on people who say it is a thing, because he says that they have skin in the game, that they're biased because they're vendors selling colos or they're vendors selling on-prem services in general. It's an interesting accusation to make when you yourself make money off the hyperscalers workloads, but we'll leave that aside for a moment. And the absurdity of the debate, the extremity of the debate, sort of summed up while I was researching for my piece recently. I got this snippet on the bottom left there, where InfoWorld in November said, "Don't buy the cloud repatriation claptrap; it's all nonsense." And then literally 2.5 months later, this is the year of cloud repatriation. So, it's like Linux. This is the year of Linux on the desktop. You're going to get lots of noise for and against. And if you care to look at the blog post I wrote, it's really a sort of a breakdown of these two very binary points of view into hopefully a more nuanced view, which I'm going to try and communicate today.
Ian, did we find any evidence for my grand hypothesis, which was basically that if you move to the cloud, you realize straight away, bang, it's expensive. So you start to automate your workflows, you start to build a team that's really good at cloud and cloud engineering. And then when you've got everything containerized, automated and working properly, then, oh shit, you might as well bring it back in-house because everything's working and you've got a great team and a great capability. And therefore you get everything you wanted, which was a cloud native stack and no cloud bill. Is there anybody out there with this idea except me?
Yes, there is. Yes, and I'm not just saying that because you're my boss. Yeah, essentially, I mean, this covers a lot of things. Unpacking that statement is going to be part of this talk, really. But very briefly, if you're going to the cloud, there is an argument that you don't actually save on operational costs, because the argument was that you go to the cloud and you don't need all those people fiddling with servers and racking and unracking or dealing with colos or whatever. But one of the things that the Hay chap says is that his operations team isn't going to grow by going back on-prem. That remains to be proved. But also, when he went to cloud, they didn't reduce their manpower either. So there is this and the other thing you touch on, which we'll cover later, is the innovation point. So is there a point where innovation stops being a priority, and then cost optimization becomes a priority? So these are things that may mean that cloud repatriation becomes more of a thing. And I'll definitely talk about that more at the end. Okay, so I mentioned that Corey Quinn accuses everyone of having skin in this game, and as Jamie's already touched on, we're a cloud native consultancy, so we're obviously not. We have some interest in this, but we don't particularly care if our customers run on-prem, colo, cloud, whatever. We don't care. We're entirely vendor neutral. We don't have partnerships with specific vendors in the space. We have been asked by some of our clients to help repatriate businesses, and the number of conversations we have about cost, isn't cloud expensive, or should we, does it save us money, and so on. That's always a topic that comes up as we're consulting. I have to declare, and I suspect Jamie's of a similar mind, I have a slightly grumpy old man view of this as well, because often I look at cloud bills and wonder where all that money's going, when I could see how I could run a web server myself, because I used to do that and run multiple for various businesses. I actually I cut my teeth working for a company that ran sort of world extremely busy systems on tin, using only a few servers. And yes, there was a cost in terms of maintenance of that, but the cost of it was actually pretty negligible. And some of the cloud costs I see, I just keep thinking, like, 20 years ago we could have run this with 2 people rather than spending $500,000 on it. So I have a slightly grumpy old man point of view here. If you want to, there's a link there also to the blog I wrote recently on this subject. Okay, so first of all, before we go on, let's define what cloud repatriation is. So there's a slight misconception in some of the debates around this, which leads to strong views. Cloud repatriation doesn't necessarily mean we're going to move all our workloads off the cloud and onto servers under people's desks. That's a very extreme example of repatriation. Cloud repatriation is the process of bringing applications or workloads either back from the cloud, or if you've never been on-prem or colo, trying the colo method of hosting. The big poster child of repatriation is Dropbox, which many people will have heard about over the years. And I'll go into more detail about what Dropbox did. But even they still retained 10% of their storage capacity in the cloud. So I don't know the details of their, the specific technical details of what they did, but I imagine that was for bursting capability. But even they were not completely got rid of the cloud for where they've used, for where they've repatriated. Most often, cloud repatriation is the movement of some workloads or sets of workloads back to some sort of rented or bought tin. And the more you look at this, the more complicated it gets, because there are cloud providers that will give you direct access to individual machines. I think Hetzner's the big one in this space, but there's Scaleway maybe as well. So if you want machines, you can hire them singly, or you can hire a section of a data center or colo, or you can bring it back to a server room literally on your premises. In my researches, I didn't find many examples of born in the cloud companies moving workloads to on-prem or colo. That doesn't mean it's not happening. And arguably it should be happening to those companies more. And again, we'll go over that. But in terms of what we've seen, there's not many talking about born in the cloud companies moving to on-prem or colo. Okay, so who's done it? When I started looking at this, I expected to find sort of dozens of companies who'd been blogging about what they've done in this area, and to my surprise, I could only find 3, or arguably 2, or arguably even 1, if you want to be really strict about it. As I say, the big one is Dropbox. There's also a mobile gaming company called Zynga, who were also well known for this in this area, and Hey, we've already talked about. So Dropbox had a project they called Magic Pocket. I don't know why it's called Magic Pocket. It sounds like there's a reason, but I don't know what it is. And essentially, Dropbox are probably all familiar with Dropbox as a product, and they're very heavily focused on storage, as you can imagine, and they use S3 to store files in, I think it was AWS. And their project was to emulate S3 on their own DCs. So essentially, I think it's petabytes or exabytes, I can't remember, some huge amount of storage they needed, and they were spending that in AWS, and presumably also spending money on egress charges, and presumably wanted to reduce the cost of that. The project took them 2 years. I think it finished in 2016, I think. And they produced an S1 statement in which they claimed that they had 75 million saved. I'm not an accountant, so I didn't comb through that in detail, but I think that 75 million saved doesn't include the capital expenditure they made over those 2 years, which was less than 75. So the number banded around is 53 million is what they spent on these DCs, I think, in the first 2 years. So, if you just take those at face value, that's $22 million saved. That's not to be sneezed at. And I also don't know if how much those costs have continued over time, but we haven't heard of them going back significantly to the cloud. And if that did happen, you'd think there'd be a bit of a fuss about it. So seems that sort of probably worked for them financially. Zynga as I say, it's a mobile gaming company who used AWS right from the early days and were a sort of poster child for AWS. And then they decided in 2011 to build their own cloud called Z Cloud. But 5 years later, they returned to AWS and published a case study in 2016. And so this is sort of can be seen as a repatriation failure, or perhaps they just learned, they could see it as a learning exercise over those 5 years. People have pointed out that AWS massively increased over that time. So I think a lot of the skepticism around repatriation comes from that era where perhaps Zynga was sort of the original poster child for repatriation and then went back. So
Ian, do you think they went back with their tails tucked between their legs, begging to be allowed to return?
Well, I speculate, and I have no hard evidence for this, but I speculate that they gave AWS a case study. So there's a link to the case study in the slides. I would be surprised if they didn't get some sort of hefty discount for coming back.
It's good that you speculate. We don't care about evidence around here. WTF, we care nothing for that.
Yeah, I mean, people have told me privately that they've managed to squeeze discounts from some of the hyperscalers by threatening to move off the cloud. And you got to assume that the hyperscalers are going to make a judgment about the seriousness of that threat.
We call that the sky maneuver now. That's going to be a new pattern in the new book, the sky maneuver.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah, got it. So you know Sky Sports, they charge you £120 per month for sports and movies and all that shit. If you ring them up and say, "No, I'm going to leave now and just stream all this stuff," massive discount straight away. Bang. The sky.
Yeah, like I want to change my mobile provider. Yeah,
absolutely. If anybody's listening and you're still paying top dollar for Sky, you're foolish. Just make a call, tell them you've got financial hardship basically because of what you have to pay them. Bang, gets fixed instantly.
Tips from the CEO.
That's neat. That you don't get to my position, mate, without thinking differently.
Yes, CJ. Okay. Yeah. So Zynga is arguably turns the 3 into 2. And finally, we've got Hey, who we've already mentioned, and they say they stand to save 7 million. So they haven't finished it yet, but they're producing more. They've since produced a blog linked down here where they say it's going really well and better than they expected, and it's all lovely and wonderful. There's some interesting quotes from Hey. So the CTO says that any mid-sized SaaS business and above with stable workloads, and those are 2 very important statements, that do not benchmark their rental bill for servers against buying their own boxes is committing financial malpractice. Now, that's a typically trenchant thing that blogger says, but it's actually gets right to the heart of it, really, which is that once your workloads are stable, this may be something you want to consider for costs. Also, he cites RDS and Elasticsearch as key products in their move. And those are 2 things that other people in the industry I've talked to have said are sort of eye-wateringly expensive in the cloud, especially if you know how to run them. So if I've run DBs, Postgres and Informix before. Informix particularly, this is old man stories now, but Informix particularly, you could run at scale with like 1 or 2 DBAs at most, and typically you get by with 1, but you probably want to have redundancy in your DBAs if you're serious. But the cost of that compared to cost of hiring a DBA compared to the cost of running big iron databases in the cloud, probably a lot cheaper to hire the person. And Elasticsearch is mainly about storing and egressing data. Managing data in the cloud can be very, very expensive. And Elasticsearch has come up a few times in my discussions with people in this area. but I thought this last quote was particularly interesting. Anyone who thinks that running a major service like ours in the cloud is simple has clearly never tried. I've yet to hear of organizations at our scale being able to materially shrink their operations team just because they moved to the cloud. And while I was putting these slides together, it occurred to me that cloud ops can be a bit like government, in that, you know, government always says we're going to hire more people to do a function, and eventually the taxpayer will save money. But of course, those people never go away, and the numbers of government employees always go up. Is cloud management a bit like that? The promise never actually comes. So that's a very interesting kind of angle to take on this and follow as we go through.
I find that one, I'd love to hear what other people think. I find that highly, highly debatable. Not least because how many of our customers have had huge operations teams, started their journey to the cloud, and then their workforce changes, their capability changes, and they are indeed left with a much smaller traditional operations team, and having their places teams like SRE teams or cross-functional teams or whatever. So I'm kind of curious here, what's your take on that one?
I've never seen so I've seen two things. One is operations team don't significantly shrink, but usually we're dealing with those teams as they're investing. So it's natural that as you're investing in cloud migration, you're going to have more people helping you with that before it's stable, and then you can reduce. And we're not around necessarily to see how that goes sometimes. The other thing I've seen is that, and it's sort of an anecdote here from a previous company I worked for. They moved to the cloud, or they were doing a huge multi-year program to move workloads to the cloud. And as part of that, a key service they were going to move to was RDS. And we had this centralized team of 20 or so DBAs who were managing data centers owned by this company, managing databases on those data centers. And those DBAs would be phoned up by one of the 6,000 development teams and say, like, "Oh, we've got a query running slow. Can you help us out?" And they'd go, "Right, well, you need to put an index on that," or this isn't normalized in the right way, or whatever. And when it was announced we were going to the cloud, everyone cheered. All the development teams cheered. Yes, we can get our, we don't have to wait 6 weeks for a server. We don't have to wait months for a database to be set up by this horrible operations team that we resent because they're always busy, too busy to help us. And these DBAs were, at first quite fearful of their jobs. And then the phone started ringing. Dev team after dev team were phoning up saying, "You will still be there to fix our database problems when we're on RDS, won't you?" And they'd say, "No, that was the whole point. You have to manage it yourself." And so these 20 DBAs was suddenly in massive demand from these 6,000 dev teams, because suddenly they realized the value of having these DBAs there. And it's not, moving to RDS does not solve your performance problems. It doesn't solve your database problems.
Were the teams doing high value work? If the team stays the same size, do people do more high value work?
Do you mean, do they adapt to doing the DBA work themselves?
Well, I suppose in the olden days, if you were sort of just logging into machines and manually rebooting servers that had crashed, I guess if a bunch of that's automated, then what would you do as an ops engineer? You do something more valuable. Yeah,
potentially. I think where the cloud shines is where you can automate upgrades. A lot of the times, resiliency comes for free. Well, not for free. You pay through the nose for it, but it comes for free in terms of effort. So yes, you could focus on other things, and the benefits of cloud are also clear when you can spin up database after database, or suddenly what you want to do a parallel test of 10 databases at a time, and they're huge, and it's business critical that you test your changes before they go out. or performance testing, you can do all that in cloud with the click of a button. Doing that in a data center can be impossible because you've run out of servers, or because you can't get hold of the central DBAs to facilitate that for you, or you need to get sign-offs, so on. So some things are massively improved by using the cloud, and some things are not. But anyway, back to the point. In aggregate, those skills were still needed. And they were, if they're not centralized, they've got to be spread across the business. And it's very hard to share someone across 3 teams who aren't in your line of business, because these centralized DBAs were paid for by the central IT function, who were always resented as a cost center. And they would have had to move to a completely different business unit, which would meant that they wouldn't be shared with other business units, which would make the whole thing a lot more complicated. So anyway, the short answer to your question is I think those people would have been there would have been in aggregate more work for people to do.
Yeah. There's lots of questions coming in, Ian, but I'm going to time them to the end. So
okay, well, if they're relevant, bring them up, because it's
I think this one is more of a general question. So, but just to let you know, lots of chatter, and we'll get you with the questions soon.
Okay, very good. How do I go down? Oh, come on. How do I go down? Right. Let me see. Okay.
I'm having a bit of a shocker today, mate, with your screen sharing. You're not like an old grumpy dev. You're like somebody's dad. How does that? How does that
fits?
Know?
That fits.
Yeah.
So who's done cloud repatriation? It's quite hard to find names. Quite hard to find big names who want to shout about it, and that can lead you to think that it's basically not a story, that it's not a thing. That these are the dogs that bark, but there are many dogs that don't bark out there. However, there's a really good piece by Andreessen Horowitz, or A16Z, who is a venture capital company specializing in SaaS investments. And they put out a piece. It's quite interesting. They put out a piece as a VC. You'd think they'd be sort of more forward thinking and more future focused, rather than saying get out of the cloud. But they had this quote, which is very quotable: "You're crazy if you don't start in the cloud, and you're crazy if you stay on it." And essentially this piece, which is a very well worth reading, makes the case that the benefits of cloud would really suit you when you're starting up. The elasticity, the flexibility, the possibility for fast innovation, the leanness with which you can grow is clear. So you've got to start in the cloud pretty much if you're a fledgling startup that they're talking to. However, you reach a point where the cost of these things outweigh the benefits, and then you're crazy to stay on it. And this chimes with what the Hayes CTO says. Any mid-sized SaaS business and above with stable workloads that does not I quoted this already, does not benchmark their rental bill for servers, can be accused of committing financial malpractice. So if it's so crazy to stay on it, why are we not hearing more names? And again, this is speculation. There is some evidence of so in my research, as I found consultants who specialize in this area were talking about some of their clients who had reason to move off the cloud. There's a screenshot of Dell, Michael Dell himself, boasting about bringing someone back into a colo and saving them millions on their cloud bills. People who do this aren't really going to talk about it, and it doesn't seem to be something that happens as a global strategy across the business. It seems to be something that happens more piecemeal for particular business units, or in particular use cases.
There seems to be just ad hoc cases, don't there, Ian?
Yeah.
I remember when I worked for KLM back in the day, they had their own data center deep buried underground with its own backup power generators, because obviously their systems could never go down. But how many people really need to go off grid? Hardly any. Maybe it's the same here. How many companies really need to not be on the cloud? So maybe this is why we see ad hoc cases. Are they similar in any way, or are all these cases different? So we know the specific use cases.
Yeah, so I'll get to this in a bit, but to summarize now, generally the big driver is cost. So maybe a new CTO comes in or CIO comes in, and new broom can chuck away old stuff. So you get cases where they try and move some workloads back to the cloud to see what the cost effect of that is.
Now, so here's an interesting thought from the comments here, or the questions here in the chat, Ian, that I think adds something to this debate. So this person, John, hi John, how are you doing? So John says we are shifting some of our AWS managed services to be our own managed services, such as MQ Broker. The reason is to be more in control, and sometimes AWS limits what we're doing. So in other words, cloud has made the easy things easy, but the hard things harder.
Yeah, and in a former life, I was working on cloud solutions for Kubernetes, and yes, it made the fact that you could spin up a new cloud instance with a click of a button was great. But when dev teams, one of these 6,000 dev teams came to us and said, we want this specific thing running on EKS, sometimes it couldn't be done, or it couldn't be done easily, or it would take a long time to deliver because of the nature of where we were. So in certain respects, yes, it can, if you're running open source software on your own servers, as many people here will be doing at home, you can do what you like. You can recompile stuff, rewrite stuff, you can try a new version, you can apply a patch, whatever you like, but then you're responsible for your own mess. So there are those swings and roundabouts. But yeah, it's interesting. I would have thought it's interesting that MQ Broker users are talking about control over cost before cost. I imagine they're both mixed in there somewhere. Maybe we can ask the person: is cost a factor for them, or is it really about control? But generally, the more specific your needs, the less likely a commodity product is going to help you. So when I was working I may have mentioned before, I worked for a company for 15 years that was late to VMs, didn't use VMs until about 3-4 years ago. They were they stayed in on-prem because milliseconds counted. So and in the early days of VMs, there were real problems with reliability in terms of if you do something, how sure are you going to be that it's going to complete within 2 milliseconds or 30 microseconds? When these things matter, then that control makes a difference. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So we're not seeing many examples of people shouting about repatriation. So in my researches, I found other surveys that said quite eye-grabbing things, like 48% of decision makers migrated apps or workloads from hyperscale providers, which sort of made me furrow my brow, because I thought that's a lot. Surely we'd have seen that in the cloud revenue numbers. But the closer you look to these surveys, the more you as Corey Quinn says, you have to be skeptical. And these particular users were 600 IT decision makers who were in colos. So they went and asked a bunch of people already in colos, have you done repatriation? And of course, many of them said yes. So this doesn't really reflect necessarily the numbers in the industry. Similarly, Open trumpeted that the open source OpenStack Cloud has grown by 166% since 2020. That was published last year. And again, I don't have access to the whole details, but and again, I'm speculating, but the fact that they promote number of CPUs. So when they're talking about 166% growth, they're talking about number of CPUs running on OpenStack. Suggests to me that they're not seeing explosive growth in customers, but the customers that are using OpenStack have grown their estate. So you have to be really careful about numbers that you see and what they mean and what they don't mean and what they say and what they don't say. But as I mentioned before, you can find examples of videos on YouTube where consultants are talking about not directly who they're talking to, but some of the conversations they're having, and I've linked to some of them there. So, you know, in summary, it is a thing, but how big a thing it is, it's very hard to determine. There's also a trend for, you know, cloud refuseniks, people who say, we've never been in the cloud and we're not going to cloud, so nah, it's never going to happen, and we love it. So, you know, again, there's a survey that said 98% of businesses are on premise. That's another survey that's got to be questioned because it's from Spiceworks, and it's with Spiceworks' own customers who tend to be small businesses. And small businesses probably don't need the cloud. They don't have enough spend for the cloud and so on. So that 98%, again, take it with a huge pinch of salt.
We have a prediction here, Ian. 2024 will be the year of OpenStack. What do you think?
I don't know. I'm not seeing evidence of that.
It might
Are they winding me up?
Somebody might be winding you up, yeah.
Yeah.
We do have good questions coming in there, Ian, but I think these are the ones that I'm going to save to the end.
Okay, very good. Yeah, and recently there was another sort of similar article to the Hay one, how Href saved $400 million in 3 years by not going to the cloud. So there's sort of people starting to come out the woodwork and saying, hey, it's trendy now not to be on the cloud. You can get some good attention by doing that. So we're going to talk about why we're doing it. Another trend, which I don't know very much about, but is definitely in the air, is vertically integrated cloud hardware. So there are companies that are now specializing, and their sales pitch is basically that they can give you hardware which is designed to run cloud type workloads and has the software on it that can do the whole thing for you. So if you like, you know, hardware and software, OpenStack type things. Oxide Computers is one of the famous ones. There's someone I can't remember there's a couple of famous sort of not household names, but tech household names.
Oxide is just
Brian Cantrell.
Brian
Cantrell, that's right, yeah. And Jess Fussell, yeah.
Who himself is quite opinionated, yeah.
He's fairly opinionated, yeah.
Brian's a very, very good public speaker, and he learned a lot from me when we shared a podium once. That's all I'm going to say there. Oxide is very esoteric, says Hugo. This is correct, Hugo. It's very esoteric. They've been quiet, Oxide, actually. They've been quite quiet for a couple of years, at least in my Twitter stream.
It's very hard to tell. I mean, they raised money.
Well, even we did that.
Sorry?
Even we did that.
Yeah, even we did that. But they raised money, which doesn't tell you anything, but they're still around. So maybe they've got some big customers, maybe they haven't. I don't know. They're not, you know, even if they had customers, they're probably not customers who want to shout about it either. So it's pretty hard to tell how big this is. But Softine's come up a few times in conversations recently in this area. So the other thing about this is, to me, this sounds like mainframes. And there is an argument why they're not mainframes, but I don't really understand it. I did look at it on Hacker News, and there was a long debate about it. But essentially, if you're paying for a big machine that can run a load of stuff in a vertically integrated way, sounds a bit mainframey to me. But presumably, it's mainframes that can run, you know, the latest stuff in a more native way. I don't know exactly perhaps you don't have to pay 8 figures every year to IBM to have them either. But if anyone's got any intel on this, I'd be really real intel on this. I'd be really interested to know.
Oh, here's a great question from my friend Willem. Isn't the cloud just a big mainframe?
Yeah, huge one.
Yeah, it's a huge one, but it's more like a mainframe with ASR33 teletype machines connected to it. It's a time-sharing computer with a slightly better interface, but only just. No,
You're not old enough to remember teletype, are you, Jamie?
I read books.
I'm not even old enough to remember teletype.
No, but there's a few people for the sales team. I'd be just kidding, guys. Just kidding.
Okay. So why would people refuse to use the cloud? Well, this is related to a lot of the reasons why people would use cloud and why they'd come off it. So cost, again, we've seen with Ahrefs. Performance, we've discussed already. Security and data sovereignty is another one. So security is one that gets people's goats. Often if you talk about, I'm not going to the cloud because it's not secure. And then they'll throw lots of ISOs at you and reasons of why the cloud is secure. But while the cloud actually has a genuinely good reputation for being secure, there's 2 reasons people might be scared of it. CIOs might be scared of it. One is that it's quite embarrassing if you have a security breach and you're using public cloud, because those breaches can be significant. So the famous one was Capital One. I think they had S3 buckets exposed to the public. And I can imagine that some board members might have turned to the CIO and said, why did you put all our stuff, give our stuff away to someone else? And they wouldn't have necessarily understood the nuances of the fact that an engineer didn't click the right button when creating their S3 buckets. And the other reason is that there may be regulatory reasons for you to have required that you have the sovereignty over your data more under your control than is the cloud can give you.
We've got a fascinating comment in the chat here, not just about data sovereignty, but hardware sovereignty. So SoftIron make a big deal, apparently, according to Charles, about their hardware provenance. So the only thing they don't make is the CPUs, but everything is assembled and built from American components, i.e. not Chinese components. And that plays very well in the eyes of the US government and military, etc.
Right. Well, we've got GovCloud. So there's whole clouds devoted to, or data centers devoted and regions devoted to government use alone, presumably because they don't want their stuff to be run alongside other stuff, even with any question that it's going to be run anywhere near anyone else's stuff. Oh, Jamie, you're on mute.
Well spotted. I was going to say again, Ian, these are very specific use cases, aren't they? The US military, etc., etc.
Very specific.
Yeah, and most people wouldn't have such constraints, would they?
No, the vast majority wouldn't. No, absolutely.
Just a quick shout out at this moment, just a tiny shout out going back to punch cards and teletypes. Stephen Porter, welcome Stephen, claims here that his first terminal was a teletype and his first job was punch cards and paper tape. So welcome, Stephen. I'm not sure anybody has ever made that claim on one of our webinars before, but how fascinating.
Did you know my dad used punch cards? So my dad's a Luddite, but when I was born, on my birth certificate, it says father computer programmer in the job. And I was like, I spotted this 5 years ago and I said, Dad, what the hell is this? And he said, oh yeah, when you were born, I had to take in any job I could get. And basically the machine would clam up and there'll be some blockage and we'd kick it and go for a pint. And that was his job as a computer programmer then. So nothing's changed really.
I'll give you one more bit of trivia, historic trivia, and then I'll let you get back on with your talk. The reason we call compilers is because we'd use punch cards that routines we'd use multiple times. So you'd grab a few punch cards that were in your library and you'd make a pile of them to feed into the machine. And so the verb to compile came from putting the punch cards together in a pile. And then later that was automated to become compilers. There
I
you
can
go.
tell what you've been reading recently, Jamie.
It's not obvious.
So yeah, security, data sovereignty, and the other one is just there's no obvious business need to move. A lot of the reasons people go to cloud is that from pressure from their own staff. So anyone old enough to remember when Java came out, every developer in the world was like, port out code to Java or write new applications in Java or I'm leaving. And a lot of companies got scared of that and decided to go to Java. And there wasn't any obvious need for them to go to Java. It was just, if you want to retain staff, you do that. And there can be a similar need with cloud. If you don't have those engineers saying those things, then maybe there's no obvious need for you to go to the cloud. Okay, so who should not repatriate? So we've touched on these things, but it's good to have a list of them. So people who should consider repatriation. The pattern seems to be if you've got homogeneous workloads. So Dropbox, they're just storage. They do one thing over and over and over again. So if you've got homogeneous workloads, Hey is the same. It's basically a 3-tier app, monolithic database, so on. These kind of workloads don't necessarily benefit from the cloud. They're not cloud native. Well, S3 is cloud native, obviously, but if you've got these single homogeneous sets of workloads, then you might want to consider repatriation. If you've got a stable product and no longer innovating. So talking to people in the industry, one of the things they said about the cloud, using the cloud, was that it allowed them to experiment very quickly with improvements to the system. So the example that was most vivid to me was someone who was a CTO of a company that ran very variable workloads. And they wanted to determine where their bottlenecks were. And basically, they just one day decided to use very fast SSDs to see what effect that would have on the system. And within a day or two, they had the answers. They found that it made things go much faster. And also they discovered a bottleneck later in the chain. Now, doing that on data centers is just potentially it's going to take months for you to procure the hardware, get sign off the hardware, deliver it to the data center, plug it in, move the data over, and so on. So the fact that they were in the cloud meant that they could do that really fast. But if you're no longer innovating, if you're no longer, if your workloads have settled down into a steady state, then the time may have come to think about repatriation. Cost we've talked about, and it's clear it can be a clear business need. The expertise available to manage. So one of the things that inhibits many companies from moving back is the fact that no one knows how to do this stuff anymore in your business, or hiring people who do know how to manage web servers by hand is becoming increasingly rare. And there's actually a thesis mentioned on a Hacker News post I'll reference later, which says that's the main reason it's not even more significant than it is at the moment. If you've got a clear business need, like a regulatory challenge or something like that, then that's another reason. So all this adds up to, like the Andreessen Horowitz piece talks about SaaS companies. So SaaS companies are a sweet spot for this. They needed innovation. They needed the ability to move fast. They needed the ability to scale fast. So they went into the cloud. Then they reaches a point where they're in cloud. The cloud costs are significantly higher than their dev costs, and so that becomes the target. So here, people who shouldn't consider repatriation, wild swings in usage, need to innovate quickly, don't care so much about cost at the moment.
But the SaaS thing, Ian, is not just a mature SaaS product, but it's a brand new SaaS product. So in the beginning of your cycle, you spend way more on marketing, and it's all about users, much less about revenue. That might have changed, by the way. So all of a sudden, investors like Horowitz and Andreessen, all of a sudden they care about profit, and that's the multiplier. But it used to be users and top line, even if you were wasting money. Now, the cloud let you scale really quickly. And so that's a specific case. And as you said, once it's mature, but if you had a mature SaaS product that was on-prem, would you then think, okay, I'll go to the cloud, sort it all out, and then come back? Probably not.
Probably not. No, no. Well, that brings us on neatly, Jamie, because I'm just going to cover something you touched on there. So what's next? So it may be topic of the week, but there's more and more people posting about this kind of thing. So we saw Ahrefs got in on the debate. There was a recent post from Michael Dell boasting about using Dell hardware to repatriating their AI analytics workloads. So ticking all the buzzword boxes there, from a hyperscaler to a co-location provider. By the way, very few people talk about going back on-prem. So no one seems to want to go back on-prem, but a lot of people talk about colos. So it's almost like it's a purchasing sweet spot. You can pay for people to manage the hardware, rack and stack, plug cables in. That's a cost you can bear, but the hyperscalers value add is not necessarily what you're after.
So there's two problems though, isn't there, with Michael Dell? Clearly he's got a horse in the race. He sells servers which would be part of a colo or hybrid solution, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to find many people without a horse in the race.
Yeah, and the second thing is he's very small. He's the size of a pint glass, and I don't know if we can trust someone who could fit inside a pint glass.
Okay, moving on. But yeah, as I mentioned earlier, 37 Signals are continuing to post about, they're doubling down on this message that it's saving them money and it's working for them. So yeah, it sounds like it's continuing, and this leads me to speculate: is there a macroeconomic reason why this is going on? So if you look at the history of interest rates, you can almost draw a line there where interest rates are low, and they were low until they were low until this year, basically, or the end of last year. Where that line is low, you tend to get more investment and innovation. Money is flowing around because money is cheap, and as money has got more expensive, you've got to wonder whether more and more businesses are going to start looking at their costs. And in fact, the 37 Signals guy says, don't reduce your payroll, because there's been a lot of layoffs recently in tech. Don't reduce your payroll, reduce your cloud cost. So it seems that people are starting to look at this. And I'm not an accountant, as I mentioned, but in times of plentiful money, you get a lot of potentially OPEX spending going on. But it may be that the accountants may come back and say, hey, if we do some CapEx, we can depreciate it over several years. Hardware seems to last longer. That's something else people are saying, that the typical shelf life of hardware used to be 3 to 5 years, and now 7 is normal. And many say, well, we use it far beyond 7. So it'd be interesting to see if interest rates continue to go up, will there be an increasing emphasis on cost cutting, and therefore many more businesses are going to look at this option. Also, this is taken from CIO.com. There seems to be a slowing of cloud spending, and similar to the OpenStack 166% argument. This article was interesting because the growth has slowed down. So we're not talking about deflation or a reduction in cloud use. We're talking about reduction in growth. However, it's gone from 33% in Q2 last year to 20%. And buried in the article is also a mention that in January, AWS revenue growth was in the mid-teens. So this may explain why AWS has suddenly started laying off not huge numbers of people. We don't know the actual numbers. 9,000 was the latest round, but we don't know how many people work for AWS. It's quite a lot. It's in the hundreds of thousands. But anyway, you can see why they'd be suddenly a bit nervous. And I'd be interested to know how many new customers AWS are getting at the moment, and how much this is existing customers increasing their spend.
I think the economic pressures are definitely a thing. Every time there's changes with it, whether it's inflation or recessionary pressures, it's always about cost cutting. Even if you just pause. So I think there probably is a relationship between maybe it won't lead to repatriation, but it might get everybody talking about it. And I definitely can imagine if you're umming and ahhing about a cloud move, you know it's expensive to do it, recession arrives, everybody pauses, Amazon shit their pants, lay people off, everybody holds their breath.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah. Interestingly, they say it's going to continue for another 2 quarters, they're projecting. So that's what their CFO is saying. And finally, I found this morning. It was a quote from Hacker News, where I think it's a professor says he had a student who did a thesis on declouding, which was apparently the academic term for cloud repatriation. But I underlined some interesting things. As companies move their operations to the cloud, it's not the disappearance of hardware from on premises, but the loss of skill sets. Later, they don't even know how to write a job description to bring people back in, which, you know, to an old person like me is quite surprising. But try finding a sysadmin who can do simple tasks like set up and properly configure a mail server. That person has never set up a mail server, I can tell you that now, because no one thinks that's simple. But people who could have a go at it seem to be rarer. So
I tried to do it once. I've got a vague memory of when I was about 21 trying to do this, and I was like, what the fuck is this?
Yeah. I remember the SMTB book that was on some people's desks was, you know, about 1,500 pages long.
That being said, the best thing I did is I once wrote a web server because I didn't understand HTTP protocols and I wanted to understand it. So I wrote a web server. That was really cool, but then I couldn't be bothered to add HTTPS.
Probably quite wise.
Yeah, I miss those days. I definitely, Ian, I think the cloud providers are banking on this. They're banking on this at the turn of the last century. Okay, this is my last historical point. Turn of the last century, when the electricity grids came online, obviously over 20, 30, 40 years, all previous electrical engineers who used to work in factories no longer work there. There was instead a much smaller workforce running the national grid. Surely this is part of the cloud's long-term play. Everybody will de-skill, and there'll just be a handful of people within the cloud providers who know how to do this stuff. And then you can't repatriate even if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And it still amazes me that Amazon made a huge amount of money by just provisioning web servers.
Yeah, giving you SMTP sorting that out so we don't have to.
Yeah, it's yeah. So yeah, there is that argument that they're investing in that cratering of skills. So from a selfish point of view, if those skills come back in fashion, then you know, that might be my retirement sorted.
Oh, sign me up for a bit of SSH. I miss all that stuff. I don't think I could do it anymore.
We'll be just like COBOL developers for Y2K.
Yeah.
I'm old enough to know Java when it was trendy. It was very trendy once upon a time. Now, Ian, I think I speak for everybody on the call when we're very grateful for all the research you've done and then pulled together into a really cool, cohesive narrative. Are you now ready for questions?
I am.
By the way, before we do that, I want to give a shout out to Andrew Maloney. So we mentioned earlier Soft Iron, the company. Well, the chief marketing officer is on the call today. So welcome. And you got a shout out. Your product got a shout out, and we didn't even know you were here. Now I know what Andrew's thinking. How can I get involved in sponsoring events like this? So I'll just drop the link in the chat box there for him, and something he can look into for our next conference. But it's good to have a cross section of the community here. So welcome, Andrew. Right, questions. Ian, we've got a few questions. First one: is it an intelligent decision to repatriate? Probably not, by the way. Or is it better to understand more about cloud strategy and continue there?
Well, it depends, right? I mean, I think Dropbox would say it is a good idea for them because of their specific circumstances. So because they had this very constrained load, a mature product, spending absolute tons in the cloud, millions and millions and millions, you know, if you have to go out and pay $500,000 a year for some expert in something esoteric hardware related, then you can do that and it can be justified. But for many businesses, I think especially if you're using lots of different bits of the cloud, unpicking that is going to be really, really hard. So, you know, I'd have to explore the specifics of that use case to know whether it's a good idea.
Now, I've got a question that's come up from today, Ian. I don't know if we can answer this, and I say we because we work on the same team. Because the person wants to know the top 5 reasons why we would advise a client not to go to the cloud. Now, the reason I say this might be hard to find 5 reasons is because if a customer, for example, is off the grid, we're doing some air-gapped cloud work, then obviously they know already that they're not going to a public cloud or air-gapped Kubernetes. So what would be our top 5 reasons, mate, for a customer not to go to the cloud?
So one, I can think of one very specific example. I'm obviously not going to name the client, but we went to one client that was a very big company, and they had a system that was basically their cash cow, and it was written in a language. It was written in a fork of a language of the COBOL era. I can't remember what it was. And they had like they had to hire 3 people to maintain it. And they were saying, we've got to go to the cloud because this is so old. And we kind of said, oh, whoa there. First of all, it's going to be really hard to move that to the cloud because you've got 50 years worth of business logic buried in there. And, you know, you can go to the cloud with start with a mobile app, put that in the cloud.
Yeah.
Then do your main website. Then you know, build the expertise and the muscle memory first before you get your crown jewels and try and move that to the cloud, because that monolithic kind of big migration, it's going to be tough to make that work.
Yeah, I remember visiting a finance customer, but it was problematic. Everything was running COBOL from 50 years ago, but at the same time, there was nobody left who could edit COBOL and actually. So the solution was, can we start to dismantle this? But it was extremely difficult. Or you had to then retrain. One of the strategic solutions to this was retrain graduates in COBOL and pay them a massive amount of money to run this. So in the one hand, it was like, okay, maybe we don't need to think about the cloud now, but how can we get this whole stack of essentially APIs from the COBOL mainframes into something more modern and manageable, and then maybe later go to the cloud. I know another reason is not now. So some people come to us, we want to go to the cloud, and it's crazy because for example, there's no idea of the new roles that will be needed within the business to support the cloud. There's no re-engineering done. If you pick up stuff and just start moving it to say, okay, now we're on the cloud, a quick ramp up will lead to a very embarrassing and quick ramp down. So we might not say never, but we'll be like, you need to slow down. You need to think about what you're going to do. You need to do a cloud native assessment from Container Solutions, right? And when you understand them and you've de-risked, then you can think about the public cloud. So it's not a hard no, but it's also not a hard yes.
Yeah, the lack of skills, the lack of like the muscle memory I talked about before.
Yeah.
If you don't have that, you might land on your face. The other thing, another reason is there can be naivety. People think it's going to be cheaper just because you think you're going to be able to sack a bunch of people, and therefore it's going to be cheaper. And you know, that can be a naive way of looking at it.
There's also, do you remember outside here on the office on Cannon Street, there was a guy, we told that guy about what we did, and he said, should I move to the cloud? And we were like, no, because you sell hot dogs off the street. That's a specific use case where we felt the cloud couldn't help him. No discount for the free consultancy.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. All right, here's a good question. I'd like to answer this, but it's your webinar, mate. Is cloud repatriation the trend? I think we probably know is the answer. But should vendors be worried and start reviewing their pricing model?
Well, if you're a CIO who's spending a lot of money in the cloud, you could leverage this moment. Or you might have you know, the dark arts of CIO-ness involve often strategic plays like threatening to move or starting an initiative to move off the cloud and then letting them know about it in order to negotiate a discount. So yes, we may see that. I don't, and I know a few people have come to me and said they've managed to get discounts off hyperscalers if they're big enough to do that.
If you go back to slide 33, my answer to the question is yes, they should be shitting themselves. And it's more or less, I think, because cloud will become commodity one day. So currently we're in a trough, everybody went to the cloud and now Amazon are firing people because everything's slowing down. But the ultimate destination for cloud will surely be pure commodity, and then it's a race to the bottom. That's good for consumers, but is it good for them? That being said, the cloud will probably change into ChatGPT and higher level services. I get that. But I think they should be worried. I think they should be worried. Where does the next 10 years worth of revenue come from?
Well, also, if it becomes the norm not to go to the cloud, or
then
more normal,
you definitely should be worried.
Yeah, because there was a time when if you're a CIO and you weren't in the cloud, you looked like the numpty of the group. But now you might look like the hero. So these fashions might have a material effect on these businesses' ability to get revenue.
Yeah. So I'm going to pick a couple more questions, Ian. Some of them have been answered in the webinar, so I'm not going to ask you them again. But this is an interesting one. Repatriation sounds like the sort of thing lots of people want to do, to lower costs, etc., but few people actually do it. Why do you think that is? And what are those barriers that are stopping people optimizing their infrastructure spend?
I suspect so. As a former developer who thought you could do everything in a weekend, I suspect a lot of people are doing little proofs of concepts in their spare time, but scaling that up to actually a real effort to move stuff from one hosting environment to another, it's pretty daunting, and you need actual. I suspect a lot of those people struggle to get the business case clear enough to actually invest to do it, and they think they can do it in a weekend or prove that it can be done in a weekend, and that's job done. But I think it's that building the business case and getting the ears of the right people. So if the CIO is not interested in repatriation yet, they're probably not going to be responsive to that kind of discussion. So that's what I reckon. I reckon that's one of the reasons it's not happening more. But thing is, we still don't know how much it is happening, and it's not being discussed openly, or it's not a strategy that people are consciously doing. It's just happening sort of accidentally.
Maybe the time's not quite right. People are umming and ahhing. Maybe in a few years, as the technology gets more mature, or the landscape changes, etc. Final question, and then I'm going to open up the mic to anybody who wants to grab the mic and shout out. How do you decide on workload placement when it comes to cloud repatriation, Ian?
How do you decide on workload placement? Do you mean what platform you should use? Or?
No, what are the key factors determine whether or not we can move workloads back on-prem, or is it better to stay in the cloud? I think you answered that, didn't you, around the stable stack, the less innovation, SaaS products that will mature.
Exactly, yeah. It's a range of factors that together make the case unanswered, compelling or not.
Yeah. On that note, now I'm going to open up the floor. Does anybody want to grab a mic? You're allowed to say thank you. Ian likes that. He'll put that in his next performance review when we speak. However, you're also allowed to ask a question or state a bold opinion. Does anybody want to grab the microphone, or does anybody have anything to say?
I'd be particularly interested if anyone's actually done this.
Yes, yeah, of course. Has anybody done it? Yeah.
Or decided not to, or thought about, that would be really interesting to me. Everyone's being very shy.
The problem is with webinars, as soon as you get over 7, nobody wants to speak, which is fair enough. It can be a bit intimidating in a large group.
I'll go then at a very, very small scale. So we're talking about sort of the thing can be expensive for small things. But so for a little project I made for a few people, I chose a backend as a service with Google, and with the idea I don't have to make my own login stuff and there was a remark about sort of your outsourced security, but you're still responsible for it. So last month, a user found a problem with our authentication 6 weeks ago. And yesterday, I got a notification from Google. Look, there's this problem with our authentication, and it's been there. If you Google, it's been there for a year. So the next small thing, it's probably going to be on DigitalOcean or Hetzner, unless it's like a perfect fit for AWS Lambda or something. It's like you've got a million sites apparently running on this thing, and you can't manage the roadmap. And yeah, so next small thing is moving back, but I'm not seeing that with big clients yet.
Yeah, that speaks to the control thing, right? You know,
yeah.
The thing is, you can blame Google. If AWS has an outage, you can blame AWS, and then everyone else is in the same boat. So again, this is sort of
that was the reason. But when people can't log into your application for a month, then you don't have a product. So yeah, that's a good reason to do that. That's why I went there in the first place.
Thank you, Willem.
Hey, it's Andrew here from SoftIron. To give you our view or in terms of what we're seeing, I can't think of any project right now that we're involved in where it actually is a repatriation project. It's actually, they're all new projects where they're trying to build that kind of cloud experience internally, rather than just repatriate workloads. I'd say that's what we're seeing. You know, my guess, well, my hunch is if it's going to happen, it's probably going to happen now. We're kind of at the beginning of that process, and I wrote a post around that maybe it's a combination of the economic climate, IT skills, you know, the cost of energy, all of those things together might be the kind of forcing function that starts that kind of repatriation happening. But I wouldn't say right now we're seeing hardly any of that. It's all new projects and creating kind of cloud native on-prem or in colo.
That's really interesting, Andrew. Thank you for that insight. That's not entirely what I was expecting, but that's really, really interesting. Thank you.
Basically, you've got something and you're thinking, oh, we need to modernize it and sort it out. Well, hold on, maybe we don't need to go to the cloud, but we can do something different.
Yeah, so I want to replicate the experience, but I don't want to actually put it in public cloud.
Now, our time, unfortunately, people, is more or less up. So I am going to use this to make a few further announcements. So first of all, this has been recorded. I forgot to mention at the top of the meeting, if you don't want to appear in the video, let us know, we'll pixelate you out. So that was number one. The second thing is there will be a feedback form. Ian and I have been threatening to have a more conversational webinar like this format today. So it's slightly different to what we usually do. Give us feedback. If you thought it was fun, entertaining, useful, let's hear it. But more importantly, if you thought I needed to speak less or speak more, or the flow was not quite right, give us a critical feedback and we'll work on this, I promise. If in general you've got feedback about container solutions, WTF or anything like that, we are always listening. Send it to us and we'll incorporate your feedback into what comes next. Second thing, we are a community. We don't function without you. So it's nice. We had a few familiar faces in January, which was great. But since then, we've had both familiar faces and new faces. So that's really good. So please spread the word. Invite your friends. Come to the conference if you're in London or if you're going to be around. The more people who come into this thing, the better. I now need to do my round of thank you. So first of all, my big thank you goes to Carla. Without these things happening, they just don't happen. So round of applause to Carla.
Thank you.
Very, very special round of applause to me for facilitating and coming in and introducing Ian. But we will reserve the biggest round of applause to Ian himself, who's done a brilliant, brilliant webinar today, and he's done all the research that none of us could be bothered to do. So thank you, Ian. It was a really, really good one today. Cheers, bud.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
And on that note, this webinar is over. We wish you wonderful Fridays, except it's only Thursday, but we're nearly there. We're nearly there. And after that, a wonderful weekend, and we will see you all next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.